You've seen the title, you know what we're doing. What is the most disappointing thing in every Pokemon game? That said, I do want to clarify how exactly I interpret disappointing for this video. I want to look at these games we've all played a million times as if it was the first time, only going into them with the knowledge of the past games in the series as well as any promotional material. So to give a simple example, compared to literally every other game on the market, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet's graphics and performance are incredibly disappointing. But compared to the Pokemon games that came before it, and the trailers that didn't hide the look of the game at all, I don't think you can consider it the biggest disappointment. It's not like it built itself up to be good in those areas and then under-delivered. Only if you hadn't seen the trailers and hadn't played Sword and Shield, only then do I think you should really be disappointed by how it looks and runs. But obviously that is personal, this entire list is personal to begin with. With that said, let's get started with the very first game in the series, Red and Blue. For some generations, I will be tossing in the third versions with the original, depending on what the most disappointing thing is, but here I don't think that applies. While all Gen 1 games are riddled with mistakes in terms of how moves work, how calculations are wrong, and how even the type effectiveness chart is inaccurate, I think that is a much bigger problem going back to the games now than it was in 1996. After all, if only one Pokemon game exists, and there the only 3 Ghost types are unable to hit Psychic types with their only Ghost type move, is that really such a big problem? Not really. It isn't a problem until you have learned over time that Ghost types are super effective against Psychic types. I mean, the type effectiveness chart that came in the manual of the game was not exactly specific to say the least. Not to mention that the number one thing people were probably accustomed to or familiar with prior to actually playing the games was the anime. And we all know that it likes to take a bit of a loose approach when it comes to battles in general. But I do think it creates another disappointment altogether. If you were watching the anime, absolutely obsessed with it, and then picked up Red or Blue, I think you would be severely disappointed in what the sprites look like. As in, some Pokemon look like complete abominations, others just look nothing like they are supposed to and do now. If seeing James use coughing made it your favorite Pokemon, you are not happy with the way it looked in Red and Blue. And I'm just talking the Western version here, the Japanese sprites of the original Red and Green were even worse. Then again, Yellow changed all these sprites to be much better, so we have to separate them, as here Yellow doesn't disappoint at all. It impresses if anything, I think Yellow has pretty nice sprites for a Game Boy game. It's also basically Pokemon animated game, so anyone going into it from the anime of those days and newly picking it up is just gonna love it and not be disappointed at all by that aspect. However, those who have experience with Red and Blue, I think those players may have ended up disappointed. Thanks to an element that is common sense today, but back then it couldn't have been. How incredibly similar Pokemon Yellow is to Red and Blue. Going forward, we all knew what to expect from third versions, that are basically the same game but slightly remixed. But at the time, that was a pretty novel concept, just like how Red and Blue were released as a pair. And while it has its benefits for sure, I do think that if you were a Pokemon fan at the time old enough to consider these things, which I wasn't, then seeing there was a new Pokemon game coming, revolving all around the mascot himself, and then learning it was basically just Red and Blue again, would be severely disappointing. When it comes to Gen 2, we are gonna put all 3 games under one umbrella. There is one big Dawn fan in the room we must acknowledge, one I am continuously going back and forth on. We all know that one of Johto's biggest problems is the way the Johto Pokemon are distributed, with many only accessible in the post-game in Kanto. On one hand, you can consider that a massive disappointment, especially at the time. You buy a new Pokemon game, you want new Pokemon, and learn they are annoyingly hard to obtain. Fair. But here's the thing. I was a kid at the time, old enough to consider these things, basically, and I never really found this much of a problem because, at the time, the Kanto Pokemon were also still very exciting. Today, 30 years and countless Gen 1 pandering later, opinions have soured on that, but back then finding a Rhyhorn, a Tauros, a Gyarados, etc., it was all still pretty exciting. It wasn't really a problem, I don't think. Hell, I remember one of my personal biggest disappointments with the games was how hard it was to get the Kanto starters, fossils and legendaries. So with that in mind, I'm not gonna pick it as the answer, even though I do think that going back to Gen 2 and even Hard Gold and Soul Silver now, it is the biggest disappointment. But at the time, I would say the biggest letdown was the complete lack of a true villain and a villainous storyline. Yeah, it exists, but it's so bare bones that it might as well not have been there. And you have to remember that while there had only been one Pokemon generation prior, villains and villainous teams were a staple of the anime. Team Rocket was in literally every episode. The whiplash between how important they were in the anime versus these games was big, and it was certainly a disappointment at the time. Today, you can argue it is a nice deviation from the trend, but at the time it felt like pretty much the only downgrade compared to Gen 1. When it comes to Gen 3, Ruby, Sapphire and Emerald at least, I know exactly what my pick is gonna be, because it was by far my biggest disappointment as a child. Even though I played both Gen 1 and Gen 2 when they were new, I consider this gen to really be my childhood generation, simply because I put way more hours into it than I did the past two games. And as someone who has always been drawn more to the collecting aspect of Pokémon rather than the battling, I cannot disregard the immense disappointment I felt when I had finished my game but didn't want my time with it to end and learned how grueling the task was of completing the Pokédex in these games. Genuinely, I have a living form deck sitting in Pokémon Home right now with about 700 Pokémon more than what existed in Gen 3, and I would still consider it easier to complete your national decks now than it was back then. That's how convoluted it was. And going from Gen 2, where the only unavailable Pokémon were the aforementioned Kanto starters, legendaries and fossils, not even counting transfer, that was a severe disappointment. It was Dexit before Dexit, and unlike Dexit, it wasn't clear to everyone prior to release, nor had it been coming, as the lack of a proper national dex in Gen 7 can be seen as a strong hint it was on the horizon. Even though FireRed and LeafGreen don't exactly fix this problem, after 2 years of Ruby and Sapphire being a thing, I don't think it can be seen as such a big disappointment anymore. Disappointing it wasn't fixed, maybe, but that's a different kind of disappointment, and for what it's worth, FireRed and LeafGreen did make some effort to at least bring back more Pokemon than Ruby and Sapphire did. In fact, I think there is very little you can criticize these remakes for, especially at the time. Looking back, you can conclude that Heart Gold and Soul Silver and Auras did more to change their original games than the GBA remakes did, but man, at the time, just seeing Kanto in full color, exploring the Savvy Islands, that was majestic. There weren't many areas in which FireRed and LeafGreen really disappointed, especially at the time, but if I had to pick one, I'd say the way Pokemon added after Gen 1 were treated was a letdown. Not only did several Gen 1 Pokemon have new evolutions now, like Golbat and Eevee, there were also just in general a lot more new names than the original 151. But if you thought it would be nice to bring your Hoenn with you on your Kanto journey, prepare to be disappointed. Not only can Golbat and Eevee not evolve into Crobat and Espeon or Umbreon until you have the National Dex, not a single non-Kanto Pokemon can evolve prior to you beating the game. You can send over a simple Zigzagoon and it won't become a Linoon until you have the National Dex. That's bizarre. That's just a weird and dumb way to incorporate the later Pokemon, rather not incorporate them. I think that especially at the time, it was really the only true blemish. Even if we weren't as sick of Gen 1 as we are now, it felt weird to suddenly have a non-evolving Golbat again. On to Gen 4, Diamond and Pearl, and here I'm gonna keep it short, which is ironic because thanks to this massive disappointment, no battle in Diamond and Pearl feels short. Yeah, the battle pace of this game was and is massively annoying. It isn't just much slower than every game that came after, it's also much slower than every game that came before. And while the well-known lack of fire types in the Sinnoh Dex is not exactly ideal either, at least that is a problem that I think plenty of people at the time didn't necessarily notice as much. If you pick Chimchar, it wasn't such a big deal, and it just naturally leads to teams that don't use fire types and always look the same, but that is a bigger problem for repeat playthroughs than for the first time. That said, Platinum fixed the issue of the ridiculously slow battles, so now we need a new disappointment. Which isn't easy, since even with the remakes existing, this is probably still the definitive Sinnoh experience. It even changes quite a lot as far as third versions go, to the point I'm really struggling to think of an element Platinum specifically, so not Diamond and Pearl before it, disappointed at. And all I can think of is that maybe it could have done a tad more to shake up the Pokemon League, so Gym Leaders, Elite Four, Champion. Emerald did that, moving Wallace up to Champion and introducing one, but all Platinum did was move Fantina up in the sequence and change the teams. Mind you, this is an absolute nitpick, I genuinely wouldn't know what else would be Platinum's biggest disappointment, but let me know in the comments if you have any ideas. And you might as well send some in for Heart Gold and Soul Silver too if you have them, because man, these were such incredible games, they still are, but especially at the time, they felt like a level Pokemon had never hit before. Gen 2 was always a little elusive, the only ones with multiple regions, which people still back for today, and Heart Gold and Soul Silver are remakes that are better in literally every aspect, and added so much to what were already content-heavy originals that it's so hard to pick out what were letdowns here. All I can think of is things the remakes should have fixed but didn't, like the level curve and the lack of Johto Pokemon discussed earlier, or the same thing as FireRed and LeafGreen, making the new Pokemon too annoying to obtain when they were the perfect thing to use to shake the experience up. But that's minor stuff in the grand scheme of things. When it comes to Gen 5, Black and White, I'm gonna do the opposite of what I did in Gen 3 and not follow my own personal experience at all. The thing is, I really enjoyed the fact that Black and White's version of Unova only features new Pokemon, and I would love to see Game Freak try that again with a new region. Because at this point, I've played the old games so much, I don't really use the old Pokemon much anymore in new games, so a bigger batch of new mons is right up my alley. But I'm not blind to the rest of the world. People absolutely hated this when Black and White first released. It was by far the biggest disappointment about the games when they first came out, and so I think I cannot ignore that and have to single it out as Black and White's answer. I mean, these games have been redeemed at this point in the fanbase and people still don't like this aspect. That says it all. But obviously it won't work for Black and White 2, as it reverted this misstep, I guess you could say. When it comes to overshooting expectations, I think this is the Pokemon game that delivers just that. Third versions were becoming stale, so Black and White 2 changed up the formula in such a unique and impressive way that it is still considered the peak of the extra version. That said, the fact it changes so much also leads to it being weaker than the originals in some aspects, and I think the most telling part of that is the story. The original Black and White were not greatly received when they first released, surprisingly enough when you look at their status now, but widely praised was the story and its tone. Black and White 2 may be a continuation of that story, but it's not remotely as interesting. There is no cool motivation here, the new Team Plasma are basically just thieves and thugs again, and the story is lacking and big time. I think that if, at the time, you picked up Black and White 2 after hearing praise about Black and White, you'd be a little disappointed at the narrative, simple as that. On to the 3DS then, with Pokémon X and Y. Not my favorite Pokémon games, let me put it that way, but most elements that I don't really vibe with here are things you could see coming from the trailers and promotional material already. The graphics are not great, and the trailers didn't hide that, and while Game Freak didn't outright say, yeah, Mega Evolution might break the power curve in the game, they did mention it was super powerful. Even the EXP share being reworked was known prior to release. But what was certainly an unpleasant thing to find out online when the games first came out was how X and Y basically didn't have a post-game. A few legendaries here and there, a short quest with Emma, and that was about it. Nothing substantial, but making matters even worse, the gap in post-game things to do between Black and White and X and Y is staggering. It's so massive, I don't think anyone saw coming that a Pokemon title with this little post-game was still possible when Black and White came out. We had gone from an entirely new region on the Game Boy Color to absolutely nothing on the 3DS. It was beyond disappointing, and I would say it is the biggest disappointment in the entire video. Next is Arceus, and I can keep things to 2 words here. Battle Frontier. Where is it? How is it possible that Heart Gold and Soul Silver introduced a Battle Frontier to Johto that was never even there, yet Arceus doesn't have it when the idea literally comes from Hoenn? It makes no sense, and it is easily the biggest disappointment in what I think are pretty well-rounded remakes, all things considered. So let's just move on to Sun and Moon, as well as the Ultra games. A lot about these games was already revealed prior to its release. The amount of things the trailers revealed was beyond anything we've ever seen before or since, making my job here quite difficult. But one thing that wasn't exactly in the trailers was how much hand-holding and cutscenes these games had. Now, personally, I've always felt this criticism was a bit overblown. I mean, Pokemon games are JRPGs, those always have quite some story cutscenes and dialogue to them. I personally didn't mind it that much, but just like with Black and White, I cannot overlook the opinion of the wider audience here. I mean, it's not like I don't see the problem, especially in the first few hours, you can't take a step without Hao or Lily or whoever else butting in to tell you something that is not necessarily worth stopping the gameplay for. And as for the Ultra games, I think this still qualifies, but if you're really eager to hear another disappointment, the changes to the story have to be top 1. If you thought Black and White 2 story changes were disappointing, Ultra Sun and Moon are even worse. On to the Nintendo Switch then, although we stay in Gen 7 for Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. Games with a lot of disappointments, depending on who you'd ask and what you expected these games to be, but I don't think any trailer, review or advertisement in the world could have prepared you for how terrible this game controls. I actively, absolutely hate the one Joy-Con setup. Offering this as an option is totally cool, having this as the only option is hell on earth. Maybe I just have big hands, but one Joy-Con feels like I'm not just holding anything at all. The stick is not built to be used this extensively, and the Switch is not the Wii. Its motion controls are not as refined, not as good, and you need them the entire time to catch Pokemon. It sucks, it's not fun, and while I was prepared for mascot pandering, a lack of battle focus and more, nothing had prepared me for these terrible controls. Sword and Shield are up next, and these are interesting titles for this video because they fall exactly into that example I gave all the way back in the intro. Yeah, there is a lot to be disappointed about regarding these games, but much about it was already known before release. Dexit, the controversy about the Wild Areas tree, expectations for handholding were low after Sun and Moon, what we saw from Team Yell didn't exactly suggest they'd be a real proper evil team either. What I don't think we saw coming was that the story would be so bad. Like, everyone pretty much already knew Chairman Rose was not to be trusted, but that twist not really being a twist is far from the worst thing about it. His entire plan, it's just dumb. It doesn't really make sense, it feels incredibly contrived and just paints him like a moron who doesn't have common sense. And that is not necessarily a problem, characters are allowed to be dumb, but Chairman Rose was clearly not meant to be. So all in all, his character and the entire climax of the game fall flat in a grandiose way. Like, Gold and Silver lacked a story, an evil team, but at least it knew it lacked that. Sword and Shield acted like it had something and then failed to deliver. That is much worse. But it can always get worse. Case in point, BDSP. Oh boy, disappointment is this game's specialty. I don't think it's like overtly awful, it's completely possible to have fun with BDSP, it's just severely disappointing if you know what came before. It is by far the worst remake, it is the only one that barely adds anything, it's graphically unimpressive yet still runs poorly, it's the worst. Picking the most disappointing thing about it though is not really that easy, and that has everything to do with the fact that I feel like almost everyone saw this failure coming from the moment it was announced. So I could go for one of the countless disappointments that BDSP had compared to a Diamond and Pearl remake, but I don't think the game underdelivered compared to what was announced and shown. It didn't look too good, and it wasn't all that good. So while this is hardly the worst thing about BDSP, I want to highlight something that is just a disappointing cherry on the letdown cake, and that is Pokemon following you. This was a new feature for BDSP, Diamond and Pearl didn't have this, so you would think this would be one of the minor things that BDSP would have over the originals, or perhaps rather Platinum. But no. The way any Pokemon bigger than a human looks while following is just off. It's so bad, it just screams lack of care, lack of heart. Who thought it was a good idea to have the freaking Pokemon on the box of Brilliant Diamond follow you around as a static model floating behind your trainer? It's such a letdown for one of the few things about BDSP you could actually be excited about, since Pokemon following you was like a top 1 requested thing for generations on end. And yet, it still managed to disappoint. On basically the opposite end of the spectrum, Legends Arceus. Criticism was frequent when this game was first revealed, and it didn't look too hot graphically and had a Chingling moving at 1 frame per second. But I feel like nowadays, everyone agrees this is about one of the best Pokemon games out there. So what about it then still ended up disappointing? I would say the battle formula is not really that good. It's serviceable and it's nice that it's something different compared to the core series, but when you keep in mind how many people enjoy Pokemon for the battling, then I can imagine a decent part of them, if not all, were certainly let down a bit by just how underwhelming battles feel in this game, and especially how unimportant. Save for the final Volo battle, there is very little challenge in this game, there are barely even trainers to begin with due to the setting. It's not exactly subtle that if you're not a collector, that Legends Arceus might not scratch the itch you hope and are used to getting from a Pokemon game. Personally, I don't feel that way about Legends Arceus, it vastly overimpressed me compared to how I felt going in, but I can imagine that for some folks, the near disregard for battling was the biggest letdown. Then we finally make it to Scarlet and Violet, the game I touched on all the way back in the intro already, to say that no, I won't be talking about the graphics or performance here. Yes, they are terrible, or at least were terrible on release, but I don't think it can be considered a disappointment if you had seen the trailers and played the games prior to it. Maybe the poor performance, that was certainly new, but signs of that were already all over the trailers too. So instead, I want to look at something I don't think anyone expected this game to suddenly fail at after after title that nailed it: customization. Why are the customization, the outfit options of our playable characters suddenly so limited? Ever since Gen 6, this had been a constant for games and games on end. Even BDSP added this, but for some reason, Scarlet and Violet heavily dialed it back, and unlike its other mistakes, I don't think anyone saw that coming. And finally, we have Legends EA. The most often heard disappointment I've seen around this game is the fact that it is entirely set in one city, leading to an explorable world that feels awfully similar in one note. But the thing is, that was definitely made clear by trailers and the like, so while you're of course allowed to feel that way, I don't think it can be the biggest disappointment. If you went into this game expecting more than just Lumio City streets, you weren't paying attention to the promo rollout. In second place, I would say you have the DLC, which I would agree with was a massive disappointment. Game Freak and the Pokemon series at large had built a great reputation for DLC with Sword and Shield and Scarlet and Violet, but this one can't even stand close to what came before. But picking something that wasn't in the base game feels a little odd, so I'm instead gonna go with the exact opposite of Legends Arceus. This one has too big a battle focus and becomes quite a tad repetitive as a result, which isn't helped by the fact that the new battle style, while fun and novel, doesn't really feel deep enough to warrant such a big focus. Now, for Legends Arceus, I think the problem was that the game didn't necessarily make clear it was such a collecting focused game prior to release, and Legends EA did not necessarily repeat that mistake. I went into Legends EA expecting more battles than collecting. I just didn't expect it to be this much. The ZA Royale is all battles, constantly, back to back to back to back. And then most conversations and moments with characters throughout the story then also result in battles. Rogue Evolution, battles again. Side quests, the majority are battles. There isn't enough in the game to offset this high focus. It's as if a standard Pokemon game didn't have routes for you to explore or catch Pokemon, but rather were just a gauntlet of battles between cities. Now obviously the wild zones do exist, and they function as routes this time, but exploring them is not as interesting, most are much smaller, and it doesn't take too long for you to have seen pretty much everything a wild zone has to offer. And then it's back to battling. I will forever die on the hill that while Pokemon games have not always been exactly the best gaming has to offer, especially in recent years, I do believe the core gameplay loop of Pokemon is the strongest in the entire industry, and that is a huge part of the reason why it's still so popular today. But Legends EA messes with that in a critical way, and that left me personally quite disappointed in that aspect. It's not a bad game at all, but whereas Legends Arceus also shifts the balance and creates something super unique and engaging with it, Legends EA didn't fully stick the landing. But that's just how I feel. What do you consider the most disappointing thing in Pokemon games? Share it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like, subscribing, and if you're also interested in either the Mario or Fire Emblem series, you may want to check out my other channels, Pichupedia and Nagapedia. Links are in the description. For now, thanks for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.